Stephen Weller, and today we're going to talk about the history of lean before we called it lean. But what is lean? Well, for the purposes of this program, we'll define lean as looking at processes from start to finish. And what we want to do is identify and eliminate waste within that process to shorten the lead time. But where do we get this definition from? Well, it comes from Taiichi Ohno, the man credited with the Toyota production system, the basis for what we call lean today. In his book, The Toyota Production System, Taiichi Ohno is quoted as saying, "All we are doing is looking at the timeline, from the moment the customer gives us an order to the point when we collect the cash. And we are reducing that timeline by removing the non-value added wastes." This film will talk about the building blocks for what we call lean today, but it will only be the tip of the iceberg. We will begin more than 2 centuries ago during the Industrial Revolution and take this journey to the early 21st century. We'll talk about the innovations and the people behind them that culminated in the Toyota production system. If not already, we hope this will kickstart an interest in the subject to learn more.
One of my primary objects is to form the tools, so the tools themselves shall fashion the work, and give to every part its just proportion. Eli Whitney.
Eli Whitney graduated from Yale, and he moved down south to Savannah, Georgia to make his fortune. There he met Catherine Green, who encouraged him to invent a device that pulls seeds from cotton, and thus came the cotton gin. However, Eli Whitney did not make much money off of the cotton gin because people started making their own cotton gins off of his design and paid him no royalties. Though he took them to court, it really did not amount to much. But Eli Whitney was persistent. He wanted his fortune, and thus he contracted with the government to manufacture muskets. Whitney decided to manufacture his muskets by producing identical parts that could be assembled together to make a musket. Each part could be used on different muskets and still function. This differed from the craftsman approach. Let's use the example of making pottery by hand as an example of craftsmanship. Each piece of pottery will not be perfectly identical to any other piece of pottery. If the craftsman was to make a lid, that lid would most likely only fit the piece of pottery it was made for. However, if you were to switch the lids between different pieces of pottery, you might quickly see they were not interchangeable. For example, the lid may be too big or too small, or have some other variance to prevent the lid from fitting perfectly on each pot. Whitney decided to make parts interchangeable between muskets by creating tools that made each part exactly the same. Each part, thus, could be used on any musket of the same design. A worker could possibly specialize in just making only a few or possibly only one part versus having to know how to make an entire musket. Whitney may not have been the first to employ such a manufacturing approach. There is evidence back in the early 1700s when Christopher Poland used machinery to make gears for watches. There's also evidence of the use of interchangeable parts during the Punic Wars, where some of the components on Carthaginian ships were identical. Let's demonstrate interchangeable parts. In this example, we have 3 pens. Each part to each pen has been manufactured individually, and each part is exactly the same to its corresponding part on the other pens. If we take them apart and mix up the pieces, we are still able to reassemble the pens using the parts, even though the individual parts may have originally come from one of the other 2 pens. The assembled pen works as intended. That demonstration we did with writing pens was similar to what Eli Whitney did with muskets. He would take the pieces apart, mix up the pieces, reassemble them to form the muskets, and demonstrate that they still worked. This wowed the observers. Henry Ford would see the same thing done but with cars, and that would influence his own production system.
No man who can work and won't work has any place under scientific management. Frederick Taylor.
Before talking about Henry Ford, let's talk about another individual who drove innovations in improved work processes. His name was Frederick Taylor. Taylor had spent much time within manufacturing facilities and observed significant inefficiencies in the way workers performed their tasks. He believed a person's work could be designed, so he began working on an objective, fact-based system to determine performance standards for workers. This would become known as scientific management. With the use of time studies to help evaluate and analyze work for constructive purposes, he and other scientific management pioneers helped to reduce unneeded movements and to optimize the organization of the rest of the work. Taylor used the studies to determine realistic goals for workers, and incentives were aligned accordingly, where workers were paid based on their production, not necessarily hours worked. Taylor took some heat for statements he made because he labeled workers as either first-class men or not. He even had to give testimony to a congressional special committee. There he clarified that workers who were able to do a job and won't do it were not first-class men. Taylor believed developing people from within an organization. He states the importance of it in the introduction to his book, The Principles of Scientific Management.
What we are looking for, however, is the ready-made, competent man, the man whom someone else has trained. It is only when we fully realize that our duty, as well as our opportunity, lies in systematically cooperating to train and to make this competent man, instead of in-hunting for a man someone else has trained, that we shall be on the road to national efficiency.
Scientific management introduced such concepts as motion studies, time studies, and production scheduling. Motion studies study the motion within a job to eliminate wasteful motion. Time studies study the time required to do a job. Production scheduling assigns resources and tasks to time slots within the production process. In this video, we see a soap packing method that was inefficient and complicated. Notice how there is also a lot of motion by the worker in an attempt to keep the workstation organized. This method was observed and timed. The movement of the worker is captured with a motion study. By combining the time and motion study, a new, more efficient method can be developed. In this scenario, notice how the improved process reduced motion to the point that the worker is now seated. Also, there is less space needed. There are 4 principles in Frederick Taylor's scientific management, which can be found in his book, The Principles of Scientific Management. The first principle is, they develop a science for each element of a man's work, which replaces the old rule of thumb method. The second principle, they scientifically select and then train, teach, and develop the workman, whereas in the past he chose his own work and trained himself as best he could. Third, they heartily cooperate with the men so as to ensure all of the work being done in accordance with the principles of the science which has been developed. The fourth, there is an almost equal division of the work and the responsibility between the management and the workmen. The management take over all work for which they are better fitted than the workmen, while in the past almost all of the work and the greater part of the responsibility were thrown upon the men. In 1899, pig iron prices rose sharply, and Frederick Taylor used this opportunity to study worker fatigue in loading pig iron. Each pig weighed about 92 pounds. At first, the average loading per worker was about 12.5 tons per day. Frederick Taylor assigned 2 men to study the loading of pig iron. 10 of the best workers were sought out and asked to work at maximum speed during day 1. Incredibly, they loaded about 75 tons each, but they were exhausted. Adjustments were made to deduct about 40% of the time for rest and delays, with rest periods properly spaced out. they created a new standard of 45 tons per day, increasing pay from $1.15 to about $1.69 per day. It is noteworthy that the allowance of 40% of the time for rest and delays was arbitrary, as well as determining the piece rate. This video of moving pig iron shows a slightly different result. They loaded about 54 tons per day for a pay of about $1.85 per day. Taylor referenced this initiative often in both writings and talks to persuade others that a systematic approach could be applied to basic work processes. Scientific management found its way into healthcare. Frank Gilbreth, an advocate for scientific management, pioneering time and motion studies, once observed a surgery. He expected to see an efficient process. However, he saw the opposite. The surgical team spent much time looking for stuff. Based on his observation, he made a recommendation that is used even today. That is simply to have someone hand the items to the surgeon when the surgeon needs them. Check out this video to see it in action.
There is a difference in a man working hard and hard work. A man working hard will produce something, whereas hard work is the least productive sort of labor. Henry Ford.
In this vintage video about the Ford assembly line, we start by learning that sub-assemblies were created where workers became specialists, doing one thing and one thing well. Work was then passed along to the next worker. This method reduced wasted time and wasted effort in the production process. Parts would then be fed to workers by gravity slides, so workers did not have to stop and wait for new parts. Parts were then put on moving conveyor belts, an innovation that helped to regulate the flow of work, keeping it moving at a constant rate of speed. The conveyor belts grew longer and more complex as they moved from place to place in the large shop. Parts were brought to the moving assembly line. According to this video, a car was being assembled every 40 seconds. Also, according to this video, this mass production method using the assembly line helped Ford to drive the price of these cars from $850 to $300, making it possible for more people to get a car. When we think about process flow within our organizations, there are many, such as production flow, information flow, and more. It is important to streamline the flow of these processes to prevent unwanted waste. We can compare flow to the flow of water. Do we want our processes to flow like a smooth running river that can move quickly without obstacles? Or do we want flow systems that are choppy, full of waste and obstacles, like a river with a bunch of boulders causing whitewater rapids, maybe even a few waterfalls in between? The latter could be quite costly, dissatisfying customers with unreliable delivery times. Henry Ford identified principles to his Ford management system and published them in his 1926 book, Today and Tomorrow. In his book, he writes, "The principles are extremely simple. They may be compressed into 3 statements. Number 1, do the job in the most direct fashion without bothering with red tape or any of the ordinary divisions of authority. Number 2, pay every man well, not less than $6 a day, and see that he is employed all the time through 48 hours a week and no longer. Number 3, put all machinery in the best possible condition. Keep it that way and insist upon absolute cleanliness everywhere in order that a man may learn to respect his tools, his surroundings, and himself. Henry Ford was not a fan of scientific management. If you brought Frederick Taylor and Henry Ford into the same room, they would likely not get along. Henry Ford did not want scientific management in any of his plants. However, there is evidence that Ford engineers brought elements of scientific management into his production system. In fact, Frank Gilbreth, a pioneer within scientific management, once visited one of his plants. There, he saw an ergonomic situation that was not ideal for effective work. He brought this up to Ford management. Their response was, "They'll get used to it." Let's say I have a process. This is my starting position. I have to walk over here to grab a marker. Then I must walk over to a dry erase board, uncap my marker, write name, put the cap back on my marker, do a happy dance, walk over here to put the marker back from where I got it, and then finally return to my starting position. Frederick Taylor, to improve this process, would have moved that marker closer to the dry erase board. Henry Ford would have done the same, but he would have also questioned the value of the happy dance.
"100 people can wait on themselves at Piggly Wiggly. Every 48 seconds, a customer leaves Piggly Wiggly with her purchase." Clarence Saunders.
Clarence Saunders once visited a Clark grocer. There he saw a customer say they weren't happy with the product the clerk had handed them. The clerk's response was, "Take what is given to you." 'Clarence Saunders had the idea of a self-service grocery experience, and he opened a Piggly Wiggly in 1916. He took advantage of new packaging and preservation techniques, such as canning, by employing methods around displaying, storing, and marketing products. To display a greater variety of products with less space, an effective replenishment method was developed. Customers could pick and pull what they wanted off the shelf and take it to a cashier, pay for their item, and take it home. The supermarket approach allowed customers to go into a store, find what they wanted, and thereby pull it off the shelf to purchase. The open space left behind had some sort of label identifying the item that belonged there. A clerk could see the open space, read what belonged in that space, and replenish the items for other customers. Toyota visited the United States while learning how to make cars. Specifically, they had visited Ford manufacturing. Though impressed, they did not have the space, capital, or resources to replicate the Ford production system, so they needed to find a different way. They visited a Piggly Wiggly and saw the supermarket method of replenishment, which gave them an idea on a new approach to manufacturing that would help them minimize inventory in their production process. Early in my manufacturing career, we had a place we called the supermarket. Anytime we pulled parts from the supermarket, a signal was sent upstream to replenish those parts. In this way, we had what we needed when we needed it.
"There is nothing that can't be done. If you can't make something, it's because you haven't tried hard enough." Sakichi Toyoda.
Sakichi Toyoda was the son of a carpenter in Nagoya, Japan. Sakichi proved to be a gifted inventor, receiving his first patent for a loom in 1891. By 1894, his looms were cheaper and performed better than his competitors. Sakichi admittedly did not draw his inspirations for his inventions through the study of mathematics or physics or by reading catalogs. He spent his time alone, pondering ideas that ultimately led to many patents. As a young boy, Sakichi Toyota would watch his mother work with a loom, and he saw the frustration she had working with that loom. So he became committed to make looms that was easier for workers. Sakichi is credited for the Jidoka concept, which was basically machines with built-in quality. He observed that when a thread broke while a loom was in operation, the machine kept running, ruining the product. Therefore, he invented a contraption so that when a thread broke, a lever dropped, stopping the machine. When we think about Jidoka within manufacturing, we typically find some form of Jidoka in a machine or a tool that can identify an error immediately and stops production, much like this futuristic car stopping for a pedestrian. Early in the 20th century, Sakichi Toyota started looking around and he started seeing automobiles popping up everywhere. He noticed there was a similarity between how automobiles and looms were manufactured. It was about this time that he decided that he wanted his company to start building automobiles.
No plant management can hold a supervisor responsible for things about which he has not been informed. C.R. Dooley.
With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States entered World War II. At this time, many of the factory workers put on the uniforms of soldiers to fight. But even before that, the United States determined they needed to improve production, so the War Manpower Commission engaged Channing Rice Dooley to develop a training program on a national scale. Once the United States entered the war, a fair question might be, how did the United States produce the beans and bullets to support these soldiers and the war effort? After all, those soldiers left their jobs in manufacturing. Well, a new workforce filled those vacant positions. However, many of those now engaged in manufacturing were people who had not traditionally worked in manufacturing, such as farmers, housewives, and more. Some skills took years to master. So, how did these new workers learn their jobs so quickly? That answer is in large part due to a program called Training Within Industry. Channing Rice Dooley graduated from Purdue University with a degree in electrical engineering. He was described as having never lost his temper, as well as being able to put a distinctly human face to training and learning. During World War I, Dooley provided advisory support to the U.S. War Department as a director to the Vocational Committee on Education and Special Training. During this time, he had developed relationships with government officials who acknowledged the importance of accelerated production during wartime. So in 1940, Channing Rice Dooley was asked to organize and direct the National Defense Committee's Training Within Industry program. He was joined by three other experts in industrial training, including Mike Kane from American Telephone and Telegraph, Walter Dietz from Western Electric, and William Conover from U.S. Steel. There were four training within industry programs. The first was job instruction training. This was used to teach workers on how to do a job. The second was job methods training, which taught workers how to improve the work. The third was job relations training, which was designed to help address people problems. Finally, there was program development, and that was used to identify and determine training program needs. The impact of these programs included airplane production increased by 300%, tank production increased by 600%, gunpowder and ammunition production increased by 1,000%. Overall, production increased by 86%, and scrap was reduced by 55%. There was also significant reduction in grievances and training time. Trainers were trained on how to deliver the training, and there was an emphasis to work from the outline and not trust to memory. The reason for this was because the training needed to fit people into production quickly so that the stream of quality war goods did not slow down. The most common of the TWI programs was job instruction training. Trainers had cards that they used to prepare training. The front side had guidance on how to get ready to instruct. The back side provided a 4-step method on how to instruct. The steps included: number 1, prepare the worker for the job. The second presented the operation, illustrating one important step at a time and stressed key points. The third was to have the worker do the job with the trainer correcting as needed. Finally, there was a follow-up where the worker was put on their own, given resources for help, and regular check-ins were made with the goal of tapering off coaching. This program was taken to Japan after World War II and was embraced by companies such as Toyota. Several years ago, I worked in manufacturing. I convinced one of our senior leaders to travel to Georgetown, Kentucky to learn about the Toyota production system. There, we had an incredible experience. We got to see job instruction training firsthand. My senior leader volunteered to be a trainee, and a Toyota trainer, using job instruction training, taught him how to assemble a relatively complicated part. This impressed my senior leader so much he convinced Toyota to come to our manufacturing facility to teach us the Toyota production system.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
The end of the war, the beginning of another peace.
You don't get ahead by making a product and then separating the good from the bad. W. Edwards Deming.
W. Edwards Deming was a statistician and a problem solver. He tried to help post-war companies in the United States improve processes, but they largely rejected him. Deming, though, found a more receptive audience to his ideas in Japan. More than receptive, Japan embraced Deming and honored him in two distinctive ways. The Deming Prize was established in 1951 for an individual who had an accomplishment in statistical theory, and for companies who achieved success in statistical applications. The Deming Prize was immediately considered a prestigious award in Japan and highly sought after. Japan also honored Deming with the highly prestigious Second Order of the Sacred Treasure Medal, crediting Deming's work for the rebirth of Japanese industries. So what did Deming do? One of the first things he did as a statistician was introduce statistics with such things as statistical process control, run charts, and so on. But he also introduced Plan, Do, Check, Act, which is basically a logical approach founded on the scientific method to solve problems in a cycle of making improvements. This concept originated not with Deming, but with a gentleman known as Walter Shewhart. The PDCA cycle is based on the Shewhart cycle. This method helped to connect the dots between cause and effect so that solutions and countermeasures directly address the causes to drive the desired effects. As early as 1950, when Deming gave a lecture, he wrote this four-step cycle on the board. Number 1, study the process, determine a change to improve, organize the team, determine data necessary, determine tasks needed, and ensure a plan is put together. Do not proceed without the plan. Number 2, perform the test to make changes, on a small scale preferably. Number 3, observe the effects. Number 4, evaluate lessons learned and, if necessary, repeat the tests. Pay attention for potential side effects. Those trained by Deming were the ones who optimized this cycle with the following 4 steps in 1951, calling it Plan, Do, Check, Act. Number 1, plan. Define a problem and hypothesize potential causes and solutions. Number 2, do. Implement the solution. Number 3, check. Evaluate the results. Number 4, act. If unsatisfactory, return to the planning step. If satisfactory, standardize the solution. It wouldn't be until the 1980s that Deming would gain the attention of companies in the United States with the televised program, If Japan Can, Why Can't We? At the end of that program, there was a special segment dedicated to Deming and his work with one of his clients using statistical methods. Shortly after the airing of that program, several U.S. companies reached out to Deming for help.
We shall learn production techniques from the American methods of mass production, but we will not copy it as is. We shall use our own research and creativity to develop a production method that suits our own country's situation. Kiichiro Toyota.
Kiichiro Toyota was the son of Sakichi Toyota. Sakichi had tasked his son Kiichiro to start up an automobile company, and that he did. Kiichiro grew up as a sickly boy showing little ability to lead. However, the opposite proved true. Kiichiro founded the car company, whose name would become synonymous with best in class. Kiichiro's leadership style differed from his contemporaries because of his integrative view of business, his inventive approach to designing a production system, his hands-on approach to product development, and his view that people learn by doing, a belief shared by Channing Rice Dooley. Kiichiro is credited with Toyota's just-in-time system, but what is just-in-time? Well, it is basically having what you need, no more and no less, when you need it, not too early and not too late. To achieve this, Kiichiro looked at the locations of his workstations within the manufacturing plants, finding that they were not in sequential order, so he put them in sequential order. This helped with manufacturing flow. Second, he noticed that there was much in-process inventory produced at each workstation, which in turn ties up cash flow and hides defects. Several workstations were overproducing. They were producing just to produce, so he put limits on how much each station could produce that would be sufficient to meet the needs of workstations downstream. For example, if Step 2 only needed 2 parts, then Step 1 would only produce 2 parts, not 200. Kiichiro was walking down his shop floor and he noticed that one of his machines was not working. The operator seemed clueless as to what was wrong. So Kiichiro took his hands, stuck them into the oil pan, and pulled out 2 handfuls of sludge. Kiichiro turned to the worker and said, "How can you expect to do your job without getting your hands dirty?"
Frequently, I'm rebuffed by people who say they're too busy and have no time for such activities. I make it a point to respond by telling people, look, you'll stop being busy either when you die or when the company goes bankrupt. Shigeo Shingo.
There were large machine presses in many manufacturing plants. Changing over the dies in these machines could take hours. To keep changing out the dies on these machines to make different parts would create considerable downtime. Therefore, to minimize that downtime, these machines had longer runs in between each changeover, where large quantities of the same product were produced. The inventory tied up cash flow. It also raised costs because they had to invest in storage. Shingo offered a new approach to machine changeover that minimized downtime, allowing for more frequent changeovers and reducing the in-process inventory. Shingo introduced a 3-step method to reduce changeover times of these large presses with massive dies that had to be replaced. Step 1 was to identify and separate internal and external tasks. The internal tasks were tasks that could only be done while the machine was off, whereas external tasks were tasks that could be done while the machine was still in operation. For example, putting the die into the machine could only happen if the machine was turned off. However, prepping the materials needed for the changeover could happen while the machine was still producing parts. By combining internal tasks together and not intermixing them with external tasks, the machine downtime could be reduced. Step 2 was to convert internal tasks to external tasks. Some tasks, like heating up the die, were traditionally internal tasks. However, with new techniques, The die could be warmed up on the side while the machine was still operating. Finally, step 3. That was to streamline, perform tasks in parallel, and eliminate redundant tasks. This final step helped to get the machine changeover to a single digit, 9-minute or less goal. Shingo would consult many companies on this process, several of whom would scoff at him at first, but then after he'd demonstrate the process, they'd become believers in single-minute exchange of dies. In the 1960s, Shingo worked with Taiichi Ono at Toyota to reduce the changeover time of one of his 1,000-pound presses, which took about 4 hours. They had been working at it diligently for several months, but they had hardly achieved their goal of 9 minutes or less. Shingo had to leave for a while, but when he came back, he was surprised to learn that Taiichi Ono, who was insistent on getting that changeover time down, had achieved his goal of 3 minutes. For this reason, Shingo credited Taiichi Ono with the birth of single-minute exchange of dies.
The production line that never stops is either excellent or terrible. Taiichi Ono.
Taiichi Ono would be tasked by Toyota to create the Toyota production system, and with the support of Toyota leadership and the help of many others, he would effectively incorporate many ideas, including all that we have talked about to this point, into this Toyota production system. Ono believed common sense is always wrong, and this thinking helped to drive new ways of producing automobiles. He valued data, but he valued facts more, which required going to the scene of the activity, or the gemba, to attain these facts. Ono pushed automation, or giving machines intelligence to prevent problems. This was built on Seikichi Toyota's Judoka innovation. Ono did not want a machine to require an operator to watch over it when the machine was working normally, so the operator could tend to several machines at once. I might highlight here also that Ono stated that there was no waste in business more terrible than overproduction. Here is a timeline with some of the innovations that Ono drove. In the 1930s, he initiated the standard work principle as a visual control mechanism. Standard work combination was a way to address complexity by combining material, workers, and machines in the most effective and efficient manner by addressing the time required to complete a cycle of work, the sequential order of work, and the minimum inventory needed to ensure work did not stop. In the 1940s, to help minimize transportation, he created production cells that were generally U-shaped. This grouped workers together into teams, and they were empowered to determine the best way to do the work. In the 1950s, during the high growth period in Japan, to ensure exact quantities needed were produced upstream, the Kanban, which roughly translates as signal, was developed. These cards moved backward to the previous step once a product was used downstream, giving them permission to produce parts. In the 1960s, the Kanban system was deployed company-wide. As mentioned earlier, Ono worked with Shingo on SMED, helping to reduce batch sizes. By the end of the 1960s, Ono established the Production Research Office to work with Toyota suppliers, and by 1971 he proclaimed that the Toyota production system had been accomplished. By this time, there was a focus on eliminating waste, leveling production, sequencing work to demand, and much more. In Ono's words, he was making a factory that operated for the company much like the human body operates for an individual. The automatic nervous system responds even when we are asleep, and thus the idea is that the factory can automatically respond when problems occur. Taiichi Ono was known for having an eccentric personality. He'd yell and throw things, fire and rehire his people throughout the day, and in fact, his people would consider it a greater honor the more public the scene. Taiichi Ono was also known for drawing a circle in the middle of a shop floor and having one of his engineers stand there all day for the simple purpose of observing. One time, Taiichi Ono went to one of the heads of his departments and asked him, "How many people do I need to double production here. Well, there were 80 people working in the department at the time, so the head of the department simply multiplied that head count by a factor of 2 and said, I need 160. Ono yelled at him and said, You think I'm a fool? I learned how to multiply by a 2 back in grade school. In the end, they did not need 160 people. They only needed 100. Up until the early 1970s, the United States had great road systems and low fuel prices, creating a demand for large cars. Therefore, with few exceptions, that is what the American car companies made, large cars. When the oil embargo of the 1970s drove up fuel prices, there was a sudden demand for smaller cars. So since few companies in the U.S. made small cars, they looked abroad. One of those companies the U.S. looked at was Toyota. To its surprise, the U.S. saw superior quality with this Japanese automaker. Not only that, their financial situation was comparatively stronger since they had less cash tied up in inventory. Toyota and General Motors would partner together to create a company called the New United Motor Manufacturing Inc., or NUMMI for short, and they opened a plant in California. Here, American workers got the opportunity to learn the Toyota production system. Some even got to travel to Japan to learn this new system. Though critical at first, many American workers began to accept this new approach to production. Now, Toyota production lines are outfitted with something called an andon cord. If a worker has a problem, all they have to do is pull this cord and they will get help. These cords were also outfitted on American assembly lines. There is a story that a new American worker hesitated pulling this cord, fearing repercussions. This employee was encouraged to pull this cord, and when he did, engineers and supervisors rushed in to help solve the problem. The employee was never reprimanded. In fact, the employee was praised for pulling the cord. People eventually studied the Toyota production system and would write books about it. One such book was The Machine That Changed the World. In there, they described the Toyota production system as lean. Years later, another book called Lean Thinking would be published, and there they identified 5 principles of lean. The first principle was identify value through the eyes of the customer. Second, map the value stream. Third, make the value stream flow. Fourth, pull to the value stream. And then 5, pursue perfection. These principles made it possible to adapt the Toyota production system to a broader number of industries. To summarize our discussion, the building blocks leading to lean began during the Industrial Revolution with Eli Whitney, who pioneered the manufacture of interchangeable parts. Decades later, Frederick Taylor helped to put the science in our work with scientific management. And Henry Ford, who was not a fan of scientific management, would scale production by improving flow using the assembly line. In Japan, Sakichi Toyoda, who manufactured looms, introduced Jidoka when he engineered his looms to stop automatically when a thread broke. Sakichi decided to transition his loom company into a manufacturer of cars. In so doing, Toyota traveled to the United States to learn how to build cars. Meanwhile, in the United States, Clarence Saunders opened a self-service supermarket. To maximize variety within the store for customers to choose from, a new technique was introduced that replenished items by clerks once pulled by customers. Toyota, after visiting a Ford factory and realizing they did not have the resources to manufacture the same way as Ford, saw how one of these supermarkets functioned and saw this as a way to produce while minimizing in-process inventory. Kiichiro Toyota, the son of Sakichi, built on the supermarket concept by introducing just-in-time, or producing only what was needed. World War II broke out and American manufacturing workers went to war, but to support the war effort, the United States needed to increase production, but using workers who had not traditionally worked in manufacturing. So, Channing Rice Dooley was brought in by the War Manpower Commission. He introduced training within industry. One of the programs was something called job instruction training, which helps speed up the time it takes to bring a worker to optimal effectiveness. After the war, to help the Japanese, training within industry was brought to Japan, and companies such as Toyota embraced it. About this time, W. Edwards Deming came to Japan, introducing statistical methods and a scientific method problem-solving approach known as Plan, Do, Check, Act, or PDCA. PDCA was embraced by Toyota. In Japan, Shigeo Shingo, arguably the first lean consultant, among many contributions, helped to push a concept called single-minute exchange of dies, in which the changeover of dies within large machines could be reduced from hours to minutes, allowing for more changeovers and reducing in-process inventory. Taiichi Ono, with the help of others and the support of Toyota leadership, would bring all these concepts together to create the Toyota production system. The Toyota production system was a continuous flow production system which minimized inventory. The American production system became a mass production system that used batching that increased the amount of in-process inventory and thus tying up cash flow. In the 1970s, with the oil embargo, the demand for small cars rose, giving car companies such as Toyota the opportunity to start producing cars in the United States. With this, American workers demonstrated that they could indeed learn the Toyota production system, which was described as lean, thus where we got the term. To conclude, I'll read an excerpt from my book. Each of the innovators mentioned were competent and pragmatic thinkers. Some were calm like Dooley, or more animated like Ono. They may not have liked each other if in the same room. Despite their differences, there was one thing they had in common. They were persistent. Maybe that is the attribute of the person who will bring to the world something that will take our progressive machine to new heights. Will that be you?